Have you ever wondered what would happen if Luffy ate the Uo Uo no Mi model Seiryu, also known as basically the dragon fruit, the same one that Kaido had in One Piece? How would this affect the storyline? And most of all, how strong would Luffy become with his new powers? In this timeline, Shanks somehow managed to get his hands on the dragon fruit instead of the rubber fruit. Instead of turning stretchy, Luffy would turn into a tiny, adorable Azure dragon, and the series would move on from there. By the time Luffy sets out on his journey, he would be fully capable of manifesting a rather large dragon, but we can assume it won't be as large as Kaido's dragon form since Luffy was not a complete adult at the time. Luffy's abilities would be vastly different, as he would no longer be accustomed to having the body of a rubber man. Instead, he would have a rather durable body with greater strength and endurance. When he is attacked by the mountain bandits, Luffy would have had a chance to escape by turning into a dragon. This means that Shanks wouldn't lose his arm, which would significantly affect many future events. In this timeline, instead of relying on the versatility of having a rubber body, such as being able to stretch and perform various moves, Luffy would focus on good old brawling. For most of his battles, Luffy would utilize his enhanced strength and durability in his human form, only transforming into a dragon when the opponent is particularly tough, or if there's enough space to transform without putting his crew and random people in danger. Starting off with the East Blue Saga, let's see how Luffy would fare in the multiple fights that arose. During this time, Luffy's durability and dragon form would make short work of the numerous villains he encountered, since none of them had the ability to use Haki. Luffy wouldn't need to use his transformation against Alvida since she was relatively underpowered. After his fight with Alvida, Luffy meets Zoro. Despite his abilities, I doubt Luffy's personality would change, so I think he would still save Zoro and Zoro would join him. Buggy would prove to be less of a nuisance since, originally, Luffy had a tough time dealing with bladed weapons as his rubber body was weak to them. With a dragon's durability, they wouldn't really pose much of a problem. Both Zoro and Luffy would instantly defeat Buggy's crew. This would be the exact same thing that would happen in his fights against Kuro and Don Krieg, and he would have fewer injuries too. His fight with Arlong would be pretty interesting since, by this time, Luffy may have to make use of his dragon form, and we'd get to see it in action. Imagine a big dragon wreaking havoc in Arlong Park. At this point, Sanji and Usopp would join him too. That would be pretty awesome. His toughest fight by far in this arc would be against Smoker. Just like in the original timeline, Luffy would find it exceedingly hard to deal with Logia users since he wouldn't know Haki, but it's a good thing that Luffy's dad would show up before he loses the battle. We're also going to assume that Luffy hadn't mastered flight during these battles, since that would just make him way too overpowered. During the Alabasta Saga, Luffy may be at a significant disadvantage against the main baddie, Crocodile. The Suna Suna no Mi is a Logia-type devil fruit that grants him the ability to create, control, and transform into sand. Back when Luffy had a rubber body, he made use of it to fill himself up with water and fight against the Sand fruit user. This method would be unusable with the dragon fruit, and Crocodile would thoroughly whip Luffy's butt. It wouldn't be until Luffy is significantly damaged that he'd be able to do a number on Crocodile. In the end, he'd definitely have to use his blood to fight the Logia user and eventually beat him up. Luffy's journey could actually end here. Because he was so dehydrated and didn't have his rubber abilities to store water in his body, he would either win through sheer luck or die of blood loss. One way I could think of this happening is that he lands a lucky hit on Crocodile, which knocks the guy out. From there, he is dragged by Zoro and the others as they regroup. If Crocodile survives, he will take over Alabasta and his criminal empire will grow. There's a chance that Robin would inevitably betray Crocodile and join the Straw Hats early on at this point too. Alabasta falls and the Straw Hats move on, with Luffy feeling depressed as he fails to save their first friend Vivi. With the dragon fruit, Luffy would face his toughest battle yet in the Sky Island Saga. Enel would prove to be a much bigger nuisance, as originally Luffy's rubber body proved to be an automatic weakness for the lightning user. The Goro Goro no Mi, a Logia-type devil fruit, granted him control over lightning. With this power, Enel could transform his body into lightning, allowing attacks to pass through him harmlessly unless they involved Haki or his elemental weaknesses. Originally, Enel was unable to use his lightning powers effectively on a man made out of rubber, but they would work much better against Luffy's dragon body. This puts into perspective just how much Luffy would lose if he actually didn't have the Gomu Gomu no Mi. Honestly, Luffy would lose in this fight, and Enel would pretty much overwhelm the rest of the Straw Hats, ending their journey. Yet, let's stay optimistic. This may devolve into a battle of attrition, since we know that Luffy would have to rely on his durability, as he wouldn't have an effective way of hurting Enel without Haki. Unless, of course, he figures out a way to do so using a weapon of some sort. I'm banking on the fact that Luffy's resilience would overcome Enel's constant attacks, and the rest of the crew would somehow manage to defeat the overpowered Logia user. Or in any case, they could just run! But what about the infamous Water 7 saga when everyone would go against our friends? And how would they even get here? Well, after running away from Enel with their lives, they arrive at Water 7. Since they suffered loss after loss, the duel between Luffy and Usopp wouldn't happen. Instead, they train to become stronger, and that's when Robin goes missing. Of course, they become allies with the Galley, Law Company, and the Frankie family. By this time, Luffy should develop techniques like increasing the strength of his bolo breath breath or developing the Dragon Twister technique to send wind slashes toward his enemies. Just like how Luffy developed Gear 2nd and 3rd, he should also be able to further develop the powers of the Dragon Fruit. At the same time, he should also be able to use the Flame Cloud ability better and effectively be able to fly. After overpowering Blueno, Luffy and the rest of the Straw Hats break Robin out, and the fight against CP9 breaks out. Because he's just so overpowered at this point, Luffy immediately carries the fight and eventually meets Lucci. I have to admit, the fight with Lucci would look pretty awesome, seeing a leopard and a dragon duke it out. This fight would weigh heavily in Luffy's favor though, as both fighters use Zoan-type Devil Fruits, but Luffy's Devil Fruit is on an entirely different level than the Neko Neko no Mi model leopard that Lucci uses. Their fight goes on, and as Lucci transforms into his hybrid form, so does Luffy. However, no matter what Lucci does, his attacks barely scratch Luffy's skin. Instead of a close fight during their last battle, this becomes an easy win for Luffy. I also believe the Going Merry would be able to last much longer if Luffy had the Dragon Fruit, since he could use his Flame Clouds to carry it over and protect it from the numerous falls and damage it has sustained. So they wouldn't have to say goodbye to the Going Merry in this saga, maybe later on. But that's where a huge plot twist comes in. Most of the fights in the Thriller Bark saga would prove to be similar, except for the fight with Oars. Having a dragon on their side would vastly improve the firepower the Straw Hats would have access to. Luffy would be able to fight against Oars on much better footing, without even the need to absorb shadows and become Nightmare Luffy. Or maybe we'd see a Nightmare Dragon Luffy, which would be way cooler. Gecko Moria would probably pose less of a threat than in the original timeline, since enhanced strength and durability really do go a long way. But what about the Summit War? Well, starting off with the Sabaody Archipelago, the story would already take a crazy turn. Now, trust me on this one, because I think with how strong Luffy is, he'd be able to fight off Kuma, and there wouldn't be any time skip at all. This is both a good and bad thing. First, the Straw Hats wouldn't be separated, and they'd still stick together, possibly with all of them being involved in the battle to save Ace. On another note, this means that it will hamper the Straw Hats' growth. They might not become as strong as they are in the current timeline, but let's say that they do stick together, and we'll flash forward to the Summit War. There are some even crazier changes that are going to happen here. Luffy's never going to meet Hancock because he never got transported to Amazon Lily, meaning that her love for Luffy is no longer going to blossom. He also won't meet Bentham and Impel Down, and their legendary friendship would never happen. The Straw Hats with the Whitebeard Pirates would try to save Ace, but this time they wouldn't have help from characters such as Crocodile, Jinbei, and Ivankov. They're all on their own. Although Luffy is much stronger because of his Devil Fruit, when he charges forward, he'll still be stopped by the three admirals as well as Sengoku and Garp. He'd also be majorly injured later on because, as we all know, Crocodile was the one that kept saving him, and Crocodile also saved Ace. What would happen is that Ace would immediately get executed, and this would devastate Luffy. Whitebeard would order the Straw Hats to retreat as they covered their backs. The Straw Hats would successfully escape with Law's help, but the Whitebeard Pirates would most likely be wiped out. With Ace dying early on in the battle, they would charge forward no matter what. When Shanks arrives, he'll most likely see that the war is already over, leading to the destruction of the Whitebeard Pirates. Luffy would awaken back in Sabaody. He would not train with Rayleigh, and of course, he wouldn't get stronger. The time skip wouldn't occur, and the Straw Hats would be desperate and weaker than they were in the original timeline. And for the story's sake, I think they trained on their own. Luffy would also find it difficult to fight to his full extent in enclosed spaces, and the fights would mostly be Luffy using his excessive strength and endurance to come out on top. Transforming into a massive dragon every time you need to fight definitely lowers your options, but this wouldn't be an issue when Luffy finally unlocks his hybrid form. I also wonder if Chopper's Rumble Balls would help Luffy out. They were specifically made to augment Chopper's own Devil Fruit, but he may be able to develop a pill that could help Luffy add more weapons or forms to his arsenal, which would vastly change many other fights. I can't really make a proper opinion on this since we haven't seen any other Zoan users use the Rumble Ball. Other than these, Luffy would have a much easier time when faced with the various monsters and beasts in the world, since his size would effectively dwarf most of them. The sea would also pose less of a threat, since Luffy can simply go into the air and fly around while using his ranged attacks to take out various enemies. Moving forward, do you remember the Fishman Island saga? By this time, Luffy has learned to utilize Haki and has effectively become much stronger than before. But instead of training with the Dark King himself, he mainly gained it from experience, sort of like how Zoro does it. He wouldn't be able to use his beast form for most of this saga since it's underwater, and limited space is an inherent issue with the form. But since Luffy would have gotten much better at utilizing Haki, he would still prove to be an absolute menace with his enhanced strength. The rest of the team would need to carry for most of the saga, but that's fine since they're all sufficiently capable. On another note, Jinbei is still stuck in Impel Down. Luffy still fights Hody and his army of 100,000, and because the battle area was mostly open, Luffy decimated them. He transformed into his Azure Dragon form and rained fire on all of the fishmen. With the help of the other Straw Hats, Luffy eventually won, but they wouldn't have a new crew member as they moved to Punk Hazard. The Dressrosa saga, on the other hand, would be much cooler. First of all, it would be a bit harder for Luffy to fight in the arena, considering he's using a disguise to win Ace's Devil Fruit. Luffy would be unable to use his beast form for the entirety of the tournament, since that would easily give him away. He would still win the tournament because of the strength the Dragon Fruit gave him, and he would also meet Sabo. The same things happen until Luffy would eventually have to face off against the big bad of the series. And this was the first time Luffy showed off his Gear 4 while fighting against the heavenly demon Donkey Ho Doflamingo. The Ito Ito no Mi, a Paramecia-type devil fruit, allows him to create and manipulate strings. This power grants him versatile control over thin, razor-sharp threads that he can use for offensive and defensive purposes. At this point, Luffy should be able to unlock the full potential of his hybrid form, which should be one of the coolest looking forms around if Kaido is anything to go by. This would be the only way that Luffy would be able to fight against Doflamingo, and we'll assume that his hybrid form at the time would be a bulkier version, since I have plans for him to slim down later. The bulkier version makes sense since Luffy developed Bounceman to fight against the larger and more powerful animals on Rusukena, and he would need a similar form to combat them in this timeline. All things considered, the fight with Doflamingo would still be exceptionally difficult. The fight drags on, and both Luffy and Doflamingo are severely wounded. Still, he was in trouble when Doflamingo awakened his Devil Fruit. However, after turning into a complete dragon once again and using his Bolo Breath, Luffy was able to overwhelm Doflamingo and win the fight. During this saga, Luffy's most interesting battle would be against Katakuri. Imagine a weaker version of Kaido fighting against a stronger version of Luffy, since Katakuri technically has a similar arsenal to Luffy's, only with much greater control. The Mochi Mochi no Mi grants him the ability to create, control, and transform into mochi, a sticky and elastic substance. This power allows Katakuri to reshape his body, stretch his limbs, and form various weapons and defenses out of mochi. Moreover, Luffy's beast form would be particularly useless during this time, since it would only make him a bigger target for Katakuri to wail on. So we can assume that Luffy would most likely fight primarily in his hybrid form. Just like in the original timeline, Luffy would still need to develop his hybrid form to become faster and stronger, as otherwise Katakuri would prove to be too big of a threat. I'm thinking he'd develop a slimmer version of his hybrid form to properly deal with Katakuri and end up using his enhanced endurance to defeat him, as with the rest of the major enemies. During their battle, Luffy would most definitely get beat up at the beginning. I think before he could achieve a better version of his hybrid form, he'd get so injured that he could barely stand up. And it's worth noting that Katakuri has some insane foresight due to Kenbun-shoku Haki, and since Luffy isn't that proficient with his own Haki because he didn't train with Rayleigh, he might end up in a lot of trouble. What will most likely happen is that Luffy will brute force his way to victory, just like how Kaido does it. He'll make use of his tankiness and heavy blows to essentially fight a battle of attrition, and it might take days before a winner is decided. In the end, though, I think the Straw Hats would still survive the whole Cake Island saga, with Luffy carrying everything so far. Now, this saga is where things get a bit complicated for our story, mainly because of Kaido. I've been avoiding the Emperor until now since we're literally using his Devil Fruit as a replacement for Luffy's. But now, we have to face the elephant in the room and give Kaido a Devil Fruit worthy of him. So with this, we effectively have three options to go through. The first is that we give Kaido a Zoan-type Devil Fruit that already exists in the world and has power equivalent to the Dragon Fruit. Possible options are the Human Fruit, model Buddha, which Sengoku uses, or perhaps the Dog Fruit, model Okuchi no Makami, which Yamato uses. However, the problem with using a Devil Fruit that already exists is that it would create issues with giving the original user some other Devil Fruit. The second option is to replace Luffy's Devil Fruit with Kaido's, but that would mean that Kaido would possess the model Nika Devil Fruit, and then we'd have a hard time making Luffy come out on top, which would mess with the Joy Boy story and all. So I've effectively removed the Hito Hito no Mi model, Nika, from this world. Our third option is to give Kaido a completely new Devil Fruit, and this option seemed the most suitable. After scouring the internet, I found two possible options. The first one I skipped is a Devil Fruit with the abilities of an Oni. Although this would fit Kaido extremely well, it's no longer a feasible option, since we've seen that the Gorosei have Devil Fruits that give them the power of yokai. The Oni would fall under that category and would lead to consistency issues later on. So I went with a simpler route, giving Kaido the power of a Western dragon. Dragons portrayed in Japanese mythology are serpentine in shape, just like the dragon fruit Kaido originally used. On the other hand, dragons in Western mythology are more like giant lizards with wings that have astronomical strength and can breathe fire. For this timeline, imagine that Kaido looks like Smaug from the Lord of the Rings series, or Drogon from Game of Thrones. Choosing this would lead to fewer changes in the things Kaido has done and would make for an awesome fight down the line, since who wouldn't want to watch two dragons duking it out? Now that we've decided on Kaido getting an ancient Zoan-type Devil Fruit called the Ryu no Mi model Kyoryu, we can move on with the rest of the Wano saga. The battles between Luffy and Kaido would prove to be exceptionally destructive. Both combatants have similar abilities, but Kaido would be far stronger due to his excessive experience. Luffy would get beaten down each time until he learned how to weaponize his Conqueror's Haki. We can also expect to see Luffy develop a purple hybrid form in place of Gear 5, as we need to give our main character a power-up of some form. During the the final fight of the saga, we can assume that Luffy would have access to the vast majority of Kaido's original arsenal, including the ability to use wind, lightning, and fire in a much more destructive way. We'll also give Luffy the Kai'n Daiko, Fire Dragon Great Torch, that Kaido uses as a finisher. Imagine the battle between these two to involve very similar movesets, but in the end, our hero would finally defeat the big bad dragon. However, for the other Straw Hats, things won't be as smooth. There's a chance that Luffy would lose his entire crew in this battle because, as stated before, they aren't as strong as they were in the original timeline. In their state, I don't think Sanji and Zoro could win against Queen and King, much less the other Straw Hats. In the end, Luffy does win, but at the cost of most of the crew being killed or wounded. What's left is Brook, Robin, Chopper, and Frankie. Zoro would perish fighting King while Sanji dies fighting Queen. Nami and Usopp would also fall in battle. The only way they won was that Luffy kept on fighting, eliminating all their enemies one by one until there was no one left. So what do they do after the Wano arc? Well, another issue with the story would be the existence of Nika. If Nika were to exist in this timeline, it would change a lot of things since Luffy would no longer be the destined warrior of liberation, and that title would instead be thrown onto someone else. This would vastly change the story, and as such, we'll assume that the Uo no Mi is actually what the legends are about instead of Nika. Imagine that instead of the warrior of liberation in the form of Nika, the world of One Piece would have the dragon of liberation as a symbol, spoken of in hushed tones all over the world. This would fit the general mythos of Nika as well in a way, since Nika was supposedly a benevolent figure who would liberate slaves and bring joy wherever he went. In comparison, the Azure Dragon is considered a dragon god and a guardian spirit, so it can be supposed that Joy Boy could have wielded this fruit and helped protect and liberate slaves worldwide. This would also fit as the Azure Dragon, being a guardian deity, would be capable of fighting off against yokai and other demonic beasts, which would put the dragon fruit up against the yokai-based devil fruit that the Five Elders use. The major problem this would lead to is that the world government would instantly recognize this devil fruit the first time Luffy goes into his beast form. The Gomu Gomu no Mi easily hid its true nature as a mythical Zoan type, since it gave Luffy abilities similar to that of a Paramecia-type devil fruit. As such, the Five Elders in the world government didn't look twice, and Luffy was going around and liberating islands since they didn't have to fear that Nika would make a reappearance. It wasn't until Luffy was significantly stronger and his devil fruit awakened that the drums of liberation made enough of an impact to have Luffy in everyone's sights. With Luffy now having the dragon fruit, the Five Elders would be quick to discover Luffy as news of a massive dragon from legends would spread like wildfire. A possible workaround to all of this is if Luffy couldn't turn into his pure beast form but instead always turned into a human hybrid. The reduced size and the fact that he doesn't look like a dragon would help hide Luffy's devil fruit from the world government for enough time until he eventually becomes strong enough to take on the Elders. Beyond individual battles, the broader narrative implications are significant. The world would recognize Luffy's devil fruit much earlier, potentially attracting the attention of the world government sooner. The mythos of the Dragon of Liberation could replace that of Nika, reshaping the historical and cultural backdrop of One Piece. In this alternate timeline, Luffy's interactions with his crew and allies would also evolve. His dragon form's immense power and versatility would offer new tactical options and create different dynamics within the Straw Hat crew. The Going Merry might last longer with Luffy using his flame clouds to protect it from damage, altering key emotional moments in the story. The latest saga in One Piece would see Luffy utilizing his power to the fullest. In the current timeline, Luffy has significant issues maintaining Gear 5 for a long time. But since Zoan-type transformations can be maintained much longer, Luffy would pose a threat for much longer as well, and could fight against many of the enemies more effectively. This especially includes the Elders, who later show up during the Egghead arc. His size would be large enough to fight on more equal footing, and the area is large enough for Luffy to make full use of his Fire Dragon Great Torch while in his beast form. The Elders' regeneration still proves to be a massive problem, since even Nika, with all of the abilities he had, could not inflict lasting damage on these overpowered beasts. Escaping, on the other hand, would be much easier to accomplish, since Luffy could use his ability to fly to quickly take his crew out of harm's way and escape. But how would Luffy even reach Egghead Island? Well, let's assume that Luffy did continue his journey, and that a few of his crew members fell in battle during the Wano arc. They all try to keep going and find the One Piece, but at this point, Luffy has become colder, and his friendly personality has disappeared. He might try to brute force his way again, losing the compassion he had for his friends and others around him. Luffy has a chance to become one of the most brutal pirates in all of existence. As they fight the Elders, he might not try to escape and just push through the battle. This will inevitably end in the death of Luffy and the remaining members of his crew, as well as everyone else on his side during the battle. Even the giants there would most likely return or retreat as they see that the legend they had always hoped would return has been nothing but a shell of his former self. Sure, they'll still put up a fight, but when Luffy goes down, they might give up and fall into despair. At this stage of the story, the world government would have full control, and they would no longer have to worry about the Dragon of Liberation getting in their way. Luffy's legend ends here in one of the saddest ways possible. If you liked the video, make sure to smash the like button, subscribe, and click the notification bell for more videos like this one.